Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Violence continues in Afghanistan. Election results have been postponed until November. A Human Rights Watch report says Afghan national security forces trained by U.S. intelligence agencies and special forces are involved in atrocities and possibly war crimes. In April this year, U.S. revoked the entry visa for the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Pradip Phanjoubam. The decision was thought to be the U.S. response to Ms. Bensouda's investigation into possible war crimes by American forces and their allies in Afghanistan at that time. The U.S. Secretary of State had warned the U.S. might refuse or revoke visas to any ICC staff involved in such probes. Talks with the Taliban are stalled. Taliban attacks continue to kill civilians and security forces. The Islamic State affiliates present a growing threat. The landscape doesn't look promising. There's much speculation with reference to what happens if the election results are deadlocked like they were in 2014. In an interview, President Ashraf Ghani has categorically refused that he would share power with anyone else. What's going on? To discuss this, we are joined by Sir Mark Meirowiz, who's a professor at the State University in New York, Imtiaz Gul, who's Executive Director, Center for Research and Security Studies. Thank you to both of you. Mark, let's start with the Human Rights Watch report. What do you make of it?
I've looked through it. I really don't know what to make of it. Human Rights Watch is, let's put it this way, perhaps somewhat politically motivated organization, and in its past record has been accused of bias. But again, without going to that, if you just look at the report, it has a number of recommendations to Afghanistan government, U.S. government, and then at the end it has a few recommendations for the Taliban, which were very carefully written because it's different than the other sections of the report. In the Taliban, it says, take all feasible measures to protect civilians, and to the extent feasible, remove civilians from the vicinity of insurgent forces. To me, as a lawyer and as a professor, I think that doesn't mean anything at all. And even in the report, they kind of talk a little bit about the Taliban, but they weight their whole report in the way of criticizing the United States in particular. And their record, Human Rights Watch, is really, they're quite critical in general of the United States, not just in this context, but in many contexts. So I'm not really sure. I'm still reading my way through it. So I'm not really sure, and I don't really know how they developed the report. And so I won't be skeptical, but I'm going to further look into it and read it and understand it to see if it has any efficacy.
Absolutely. I guess there is a certain degree of absolutism when it comes to reports by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other such watchdog organizations. But I think one of the things that they try to do is, of course, to see which actor is the strongest. And in this case, obviously, the United States and the U.S. military is the strongest actor. So, in fact, Pentagon itself has stated that U.S. forces conducted 1,113 air raids in the month of September alone, a figure which amounts to an average of 40 air raids a day. And we also know that for years, civilians in some of Afghanistan's most volatile provinces have been complaining about these night raids. And this included, incidentally, President Hamid Karzai himself when he was the president. So there is something going on here, not just in terms of collateral damage, but also in terms of a certain degree of, shall I say, operational hubris that does not sit well with the people in Afghanistan.
Well, I can't deconstruct the problem of Afghanistan. We were talking about the report. Again, I don't know about the accuracy of the report. I think the report also talks about the coordination of the airstrikes with the paramilitary, and that, I think, is the guts of the report. It's not just the night raids, but the fact that they're coordinated with the paramilitary forces. That's quite a strong charge. So, and I don't know if it's true or not, so I don't know how to evaluate it. Clearly, the idea of having a peace process in Afghanistan is a very good thing. And I think President Trump tried to do it, and he wasn't able to do it. And that, to me, is the best result. And these reports, they sort of, maybe they muddy the water a little bit, muddy the waters a bit by bringing up all sorts of accusations and charges. And then you're trying to unravel that. instead of looking forward to resolve the peace. That's kind of where I feel about it.
Okay, Mark, let me take advantage of your presence and ask you a slightly different question in terms of the Constitution and democratic institutions that were established by the U.S. and its allies after they invaded Afghanistan. But what we have seen is that there's a lot of factionalism in Afghanistan. For instance, in Kabul, I've personally seen this. If you see the picture of Dostum on a police van, that means that the policemen sitting in that van are Uzbeks. And if you see the picture of Masood, then it's clearly the Tajiks and so on and so forth. We are also seeing this play out in Iraq and in Lebanon, the factionalism that I was talking about, whether it's ethnic or whether it's ethno-sectarian. Now, I want to ask you if you put on your professorial hat for a while and give us a sense of how this kind of factionalism actually prevents the emergence of a democracy. And I'm not particularly talking about a liberal democracy, or a democracy where the functioning of the government is not on the basis of ethno-sectarian fault lines or any other fault lines.
Well, I'm going to bring in something that might seem a little bit out of what we call in baseball left field, but if you look at the United States now and American history, what the founding fathers talked about, the danger of factions and factionalism in the ability of building a democracy or to build institutions that are viable. Clearly, the problem of factionalism, whether it's ethnic, sectarian, is an epidemic around the world. And we even see it here in the United States. We have factionalism. It really isn't ethnic or sectarian, but it's political and political parties. And, it would be interesting to look at the founding fathers again and see what they talked about. This is what they were worried about. So I agree with you that this problem is a stumbling block to building a democracy or to building institutions of government. You can't do that if everybody is just pushing their own faction. And it doesn't make a difference if it's in Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, or anywhere else. You cannot construct workable institutions if the factions are pursuing their own interests. That's why the American system developed the concept of checks and balances and institutions that compete with each other to prevent these factions from overtaking any particular part of the government. I mean, I don't know if we can impose that, but we would maybe want to consider doing that in some of these other societies. And maybe Americans, when they work with these countries, are using the American model, and maybe that doesn't fit.
Okay. Thank you. That was Professor Meirowiz speaking with us. Let me hop over to Imtiaz Gul here. Imtiaz, you've been looking at Afghanistan very closely for many, many years now. What do you make of the situation? So let's begin with violence and the stalled talks.
Well, I think the situation in Afghanistan has never been this fluid. If you look at the political landscape in which you have two main contestants for the president's office, and both have been claiming victories. And with that, we have seen the violence has accompanied all the political developments. And I think this is an extremely critical juncture for all those people who have been talking about democracy in Afghanistan, in a society which is still very much medieval, very much tribal, where democracy is more synonymous with the kind of jirga, the local tribal assemblies that are held. And in that, I think all this talk about factionalism remains or becomes very relevant, just because it's a culturally diverse country and people owe their affiliations to the tribes that they belong to. And this is what you see everywhere in Afghanistan. So talking about democracy, the Westminster way or the Washingtonian way, I think has been a farce that was developed or imposed on Afghanistan under President Bush. And now I think people are seeing the fault lines that were created because of the perusal of certain model of democracy or governance, which is not valid for Afghanistan even today. I mean, a part of it is not valid even for parts of Pakistan, which is a functional democracy. So I think right now it's a very critical situation for Afghanistan, and all the efforts that we have seen going into the nation building have partially been productive. And one would only hope that we just come to some sort of conclusion as a result of the announcement of the presidential elections in about 2 weeks from now.
Imtiaz, I'm also joined by Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard, who's an analyst, joins us from Kabul. Thank you, Mr. Hamdard. I will get back to you, but let me just go back to Imtiaz Gul first. Imtiaz, you're right. I mean, there is the sort of, the factionalism that I talked about. This is more sort of tribal in nature as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But my own observation in the urban centers is also that since 2001, there is an entire generation that has come up. This generation has aspirations. This is what I would also call a digital generation. And these boys and girls, and some of them have actually got very, good degrees even from universities abroad. And they want to have a system which gives them a voice. And of course, they are still out of sync with the political realities of Afghanistan. But do you think this generation could begin to play that part in terms of the evolution of democracy in Afghanistan, or do you think we are being optimistic here?
Yeah, we should stay optimistic. I mean, you're right, there's an entire generation that has grown up after having education from the West as well as in Pakistan and in some other countries. And these people, these young boys and girls have aspirations. And also Afghanistan has changed. One must admit, in the last 18 years, I have seen Kabul lay in rubble, in ruins in the mid-90s, late 90s, shortly before the Taliban, also after the Taliban. So it was a devastated capital in those days. But now Kabul has changed, has transformed. And also we have seen a transformed new generation of young leaders. However, the key would lie in whether these young leaders, future leaders, do get a chance to influence the policy making and decision making and implementation. So that is a far cry if you look at the situation, and it's the entire landscape and the governance structures still, I think, remain dominated by ethnicity. They're ethnocentric, and of course, then there are typical, usual problems that accompany the evolution of a system in a country like Afghanistan. This is corruption, misgovernance, mismanagement, which has also been precipitated by the way the American forces, the CIA, has conducted itself in Afghanistan. For instance, these violence, the night raids, they are still taking place. The CIA had put in place some termination squads, had trained young Afghans in those days, and they have been one of the major sources of violence and extermination of unwanted people in Afghanistan. So that's a major irritant, I think, even today.
That's what the Human Rights Watch report also talks about. Imtiaz, stay with me. Let me over to Kabul. Mr. Hamdard, I'm assuming that you've read the Human Rights Watch report. If you have, what are your first thoughts about it?
Well, regarding the human rights reports, of course, when there is war going on, both sides, the Taliban and even the Afghan military forces, may happen to make some mistakes which are against the military operations, code of conduct, and there are some exaggerations as well. But the Security Council of Afghanistan said last night that they will address all the report and they will try to work on further reforms in the security sector of Afghanistan. There are some unfortunate news, like in some of the operations done by either the security forces of Afghanistan or the international forces which are present in Afghanistan. Beside, the opposition forces are also not considering the code of conduct of the war when they are fighting against the Afghan security forces or the Americans. Unfortunately, the civilians are killed, and the number of civilians killed in Afghanistan is increasing day by day, and that is a very unfortunate situation that we could not stop, and even the Afghan government could not address that so far.
Okay, Mr. Hamdard, according to Pentagon's own estimate, they conducted, and we're talking about the American forces now, conducted over 1,000 night raids in the month of September alone, which comes to about 40 raids every day. And Nangarhar is one of the areas that is the worst hit by these raids. And people generally say that they really don't want these raids. And I remember when President Hamid Karzai was leading Afghanistan as the president, he, on more than one occasion, he opposed these raids. So something is there which people are concerned about clearly, and they want these raids to stop.
There is no doubt people do not want the night air strikes or raids or attacks by either the Afghan security forces or the American forces, and even they do not want any kind of operations by the Taliban or other opposition groups. Nobody in Afghanistan even wants to hear the sound or the noise of the bullet of the gun. The problem here is that we have been asking for stopping these night raids in the villages where people are too much disturbed, especially our new generation, the children, the girls, the students. They are very much mentally disturbed with these kind of night raids, especially when people are killed in that. So the government of Afghanistan have heard the voice of the nation, and we as political parties have also raised the voice of our nation. We want the government and we want the international community to stop the night raids, even if they are trying to kill Taliban or attack Taliban or target Taliban. And Taliban should also stop explosions in big cities, because we need to save the lives of civilians, and we need to stop killing civilians, either by the Taliban or the Afghan government in the American forces.
Mr. Hamdard, I hear you, but there's a slight difference between what an insurgent force does and how the state has to behave, because the state obviously has to play according to certain rules. But stay with me. I'll come back to you, but let me go back to Mr. Gul here. Imtiaz, let's talk about the elections and election results. Now, the Election Commission was supposed to give out the results on 19th October. Now it's been postponed to, I believe, 14th November. And the preliminary results will not be released. Yeah, that's the date, 14th November. Now, the problem is, the critics are saying that a lengthy postponement is likely to stoke political uncertainty and allegations of fraud. You have also been watching this closely. What is your take on this?
Well, I think the electoral process has already become very murky, very contentious. You can imagine that on the second day of the polling, Mr. Amrullah Saleh, who was the running mate of President Ghani, already had claimed having secured 70% of the vote. Yeah. And Dr. Abdullah, on the other hand, made a similar claim. Now, there's a big controversy around the biometrically verified votes. And we are told that some 1.9 million votes have been now biometrically verified. You can imagine there were roughly 10 million votes, out of which both have polled 1.9 million if we were to accept the biometrically verified votes. And that would mean none of them has a clear majority. And even if one of them had a majority, that would mean that he would be ruling Afghanistan with barely 10% of the total vote. And I think this brings in question the entire electoral system as to whether somebody who has polled 10, 9 or 11% of the votes can really become the president or the prime minister of a country. And I suspect that having gone through all this murky situation, both Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani may decide perhaps to form a national unity government.
Now, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say this, Imtiaz, because there's an interview by President Ghani, which I talked about in my opening, in which he was asked by the interviewer this question specifically about if there is a deadlock, like there was in 2014, and then obviously they got together and they tried to work out a modus vivendi and came up with this unity government. President Ghani said, no, I will not share power with anyone. Now, that's a statement which, and in fact, if I go back like a year or so ago when I was in Kabul and we were meeting with Abdullah, we asked him whether he was going to contest on a co-ticket with someone. He said, no way, I'm not doing that. So there are these maximalist positions here. So in the event of a deadlock, where do you think the situation will go?
Well, I think it's open to speculation of all kind, and I would rather say we should refrain from speculating on this, because you probably know that the special envoy of President Trump, Mr. Khalilzad, is still in Kabul. He's trying to, I assume, hammer out some sort of arrangement, agreement between the two people, beside trying to negotiate the release of the Australian and the American professors being held by the Taliban. So it's a very delicate situation for
It's a delicate situation. I agree with you. Thank you so much, Imtiaz Gul, speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Mr. Hamdard. Mr. Hamdard, quickly, I'm left with about a minute and a half. What is your take on this election process, the postponement of the results, and in the event that there is a deadlock?
In the last recent presidential elections, we know that the voters' turnout was very low, but it does not mean that there will be no result. Of course, if there is result, then the nation does not accept any power sharing like establishing unity government once again, national unity government once again. That's not welcomed by the people, by the whole nation in Afghanistan, because the result was zero. And either President Ghani or Dr. Abdullah will have to run the government as a president, and there should be no space for chief executive once again, which is against the constitution of the country. So a unity government once again is not welcomed by our people, by the majority of the people, and everyone in Afghanistan is willing and they are expecting the next president of Afghanistan to start the intra-Afghan peace talks with the Taliban as soon as possible, because peace should be the priority of the next government in Afghanistan. And that's the only demand and the only priority that the nation has from the next government of Afghanistan, and that's it.
Okay. Thank you. That was Hamdullah Hamdard speaking with us. Before I take a break, one of the reports says that election officials have cited several technical issues, slowing the counting of ballots, including, they say, an attempt from unknown quarters to hack the central system of Dermalog, which is the German company that provided the biometric machines that were designed to prevent duplicate votes. So that is where the situation stands as far as the election results are concerned. We will now take a short break and return to discuss separatist tendencies in India's northeast. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Last night, we made a mention of the declaration of independence by the separatist leaders in the Indian state of Manipur, establishing a government in exile in London. Tonight, we discuss the issue in some detail. Manipur is one of the 7 states in India's restive northeast. As a collection, they are generally referred to as 7 sisters. Most of these states, since they were subsumed in the Indian Union, and even before that, were racked by violence and attempts to secede from India. The Indian state's response to such attempts has been brutal. Shekhar Gupta, an eminent Indian journalist, opened one of his articles in India Today thus: "The greatest tragedy of India's northeast is that its story dies the minute its people stop dying." Or let's put it more rudely and accurately, when we Indians are not dying. This was in June 2015. Abik Burman wrote a piece in the Economic Times on February 19, 2013, titled Air Attacks in Mizoram 1966, Our Dirty Little Secret. The article recaptures the horrors of killings when then Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi got the Indian Air Force to strafe and bomb one of the towns in Mizoram after the Mizo National Army had captured some territory in the area. After the Modi government stripped occupied Kashmir of its special status, Lal Thanwala, a former Chief Minister of Mizoram, tweeted, and I quote from his tweet, "A red alert to the people of the Northeast. It has become a threat to states like Mizoram, Nagaland, and Arunachal, which are protected by the Constitution." To discuss the Northeast Blues, we are joined by Rinku Khumukcham, who is the editor of Imphal Times in Manipur, and Mr. Pradip Phanjoubam, who is editor of Imphal Free Press and author of The Northeast Question, Conflicts and Frontiers. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Mr. Rinku, let me begin with you. Give us a sense of what's happening with the separatist leaders announcing a government in exile.
Okay, well, it all surprised almost all the people of the entire state of Manipur. You know, the issues at which he mentioned is not a new issue. It begins after British left here the state of India as independent. When British left India, they left Manipur too on the same time, leaving Manipur as a separate entity, that is as a separate kingdom. So that time Manipur was partly a sovereign country, and since that time there has been a rebellion movement when the Indian government, at the time when India was making in the stage of its formation, people of the Manipur, led by Hizam Irabot, waged a war against the then government king, who was trying to unite with the Indian Union. There has been opposition since that time. That is 1948, 49, 50. There were a lot of movement there.
So there is a long history of unrest on this question of independence and sovereignty.
Yeah. There is a long history. That is why I'm going to point out. It begins since Manipur has been annexed by India, because I term it as an annexation because in 1993 September, people of the state had a convention, public convention, and in that public convention we declared that the way that Manipur was merged to India was not very illegal. Was not very legal, and it's illegal. So I term it as annexation. And at the same time, those papers published in Shillong also termed the same as annexation. That is why I coined this was annexation. Manipur was really annexed by the India. And number two, I would like
give me a clarification, Mr. Rinku. When you say annexed and annexation, the implication of that terminology is that Manipur is occupied by India. So it's an occupied territory. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's more like occupation. The then king, who was only a nominal head of the Manipur State Council. Manipur perhaps is the second Asiatic nation who had a government of the people by having a democratic election after Philippines. So Manipur is the second Asian country to have a democratic government led by a nominal head king. That time, in 1948, Manipur's council was formed, and then in 1949, the then king nominal head was called to the Shillong for some negotiation purpose, and then he was put under duress, and then later he was forced to sign the merger agreement by keeping him under duress. That is why I'm terming this word annexation.
Absolutely. I hear you loud and clear. Stay with me, Mr. Rinku. Let me go to Mr. Phanjoubam. But before I do that, I have an article in front of me which talks about certain protests which happened on 15 July 2004. It's titled Remembering the Mothers of Manipur's Protest Against Rape and Imperialism. And it says 12 elderly and middle-aged women stripped naked in front of the Kangla Fort unit of the 17th Assam Rifles of the Indian military in Manipur. The women held banners across their naked bodies which read, "Indian Army, rape us," and "Indian Army, take away our flesh." The protest was formed in response to the abduction, brutal rape, torture, and murder of a 30-year-old woman who was falsely accused by the Indian Army of being a militant. So this is a report from an Indian publication that I just read out from. Mr. Phanjoubam, do you also believe that the state has been occupied and annexed by India?
Yeah, actually, Manipur became a part of India in a very controversial manner. That is very sure. In a sense, it's already been explained that the king had gone to Shillong, which was the capital of Assam at the time, for some work, and he was kept in the house arrest. And in 4 days, he was made to sign the merger agreement. This was in 1949, September 21. And which means that when India became independent in 1947, amongst the princely states which did not join the union, Manipur, from the northeast India, Manipur and Tripura were two of them. And Sardar Patel was actually in a hurry to actually get all the princely states to sign the merger agreement. And Manipur was also compelled to actually sign it. He was kept in the house arrest. And a lot of the analysts today are saying that the manner in which the annexation took place was not proper, which is why so much of resentment is here now, that if it had been done in a more legal manner or with much more propriety, then probably the problems that we are facing in Manipur would have been a lot different. This is basically the attitude. And also, as the thing that you asked about whether it is an annexation, I think probably, that the king was there, and the king was no longer the authority of Manipur at the time, because there was as Rinku also explained, there was a constitution drawn up in 1947, and by that constitution, an election was held in 1948, and in 1948, the king was the constitutional monarch, not the sole authority of the state. So the argument now is that his signing that merger agreement may not be legally valid. And that's the point. So probably, there will have to be some kind of rectification done before it becomes legal. But after so many years, I mean, it's been 70 years or so. So I really don't know the legal points here. But that's how it stands today.
Okay, so with the announcement of government in exile and the unilateral declaration of independence, what is the mood on the street? I mean, how have people reacted to this news?
Actually, it came as a big surprise for everybody because the man who did it is very well known. He's a very successful businessman. He has a holding company, under which are a number of companies which are all doing well. And he didn't give a hint to anybody, apparently not to the company, not to any of his companies, or there's a political party he founded, and he didn't even mention this to that party, and apparently not even to his family. So when he announced this, it came as a surprise to everybody. Nobody expected it to happen. And
but what is the reaction? What is the reaction? I mean, I you're saying that it took everyone by surprise, but what exactly is the reaction on the street? I mean, what do people say?
People are actually trying to come to terms with it. But also, since there are so many other separatist movements here, people are trying to see if there is any kind of consonance with that, with the voice of dissidents which are already here. And also, for official reaction is quite clear. They have filed an FIR calling this waging war against the nation. I don't know if this can be applied here, but the state government has actually filed several FIRs against the man for doing that. But I don't know if it infringes on his freedom of speech. But as I had said earlier, on the legal point, he was citing the authority of the king, but the king's authority had been reduced or sidelined even in 1948. So I don't know if there's a legal point to be argued here, but that is how it stands. And the reaction in the street is actually one of surprise. And there are the investors of the company are actually very worried that the company may sink, all the companies rather, several companies. And also the political party which he founded, they actually disowned him, that this is his individual decision, not the company, not the political party's decision. And the parent company that he owns, Salai Holdings, has also actually disowned him, saying that this is his individual decision and the company is going to carry on as it is. And their worries are quite different. I mean, it's a matter of
so obviously
their business
it's about
sinking.
about the sinking and all that. I perfectly understand that. That was Mr. Pradip Phanjoubam speaking with us. Thank you so much. Let me go back to Mr. Rinku here. Mr. Rinku, let me ask you this question in terms of the aspirations of the people of Manipur. Now, we've seen that in occupied Kashmir, people don't want to be part of India. They've made it very clear, which is why there's such heavy security forces deployment there. Give me a sense of how the people in Manipur and other states of Northeast actually look at in terms of being part of the Indian Union.
Okay. In that matter, let me tell you straight that the Manipuri people are not very much warmongering people. They fight with a cause. They go through the channel. The unfortunate part is that even though the liberation movement that has been going on since, I told you that since the beginning of the merger with India or annexation with India, so from that time it has been going on till now. And as many as 1,528 people have been, tortured, killed. Still now cases going on. A lot of human rights violations are going on. Now, my point is that in 1995 and 96, an armed rebel group, who has been waging war against the government of India for restoring the freedom of Manipur, has submitted, a memorandum why in Manipur should not be an independent country in 95 and 96. That was submitted to the United Nations Commission for Human Rights. It is there. And again, in 1996, another armed organization, that is the Revolutionary People's Front. This Revolutionary People's Front also submitted a memorandum that why Manipur should not be decolonized to the United Nations Decolonization Committee. And also another in 1997 at the General Assembly, I think during that time. But unfortunate part is that why the UN Decolonization Committee, is becoming non-existent these days.
Okay, so tell me, since I also have to wrap up, I'm running out of time. Is this sentiment of seceding from India is just in Manipur, or does it run through other states of Northeast also?
For other states, they might have in condition, but for the state of Manipur as well as Tripura, it is different. Manipur was a kingdom. It was never under the British rule. When during there was a British rule.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. You explained that. But before I wrap up, one final question and a quick reply. Since you are a journalist based in Imphal, and you run a newspaper, when I used to speak with Kashmiri journalists, they always had this complaint against mainstream Indian media that they tell lies about Kashmir. Do you think that the mainstream Indian media reports on Manipur and the developments accurately, or do you think that they fudge facts?
Not only the mainstream Indian media, even the international media. This is the only first time that the international media is speaking of a story concerns about Manipur. That is a fortunate part. And then I think the latest days, when the international media started picking up stories about Manipur, then the mainstream media also will pick up. But we are very unhappy with mainstream media for not picking up stories of the killing of our children, our brothers, sisters, under
the same complaint as the Kashmiri media. The Indian mainstream media is now so much under control of the union government and the BJP government that It refuses, barring some very honorable exceptions, I must add, refuses to actually tell the truth. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Rinku speaking with us from Imphal. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.